Welcome to Big Blend Radio, where we celebrate variety and how it adds spice to quality of life. Welcome, everyone, to Big Blend Radio's Nature Connection show. Very excited to have Alyson F. Brokaw join us here today to talk about bats. I'm so excited about this. I've been waiting for this interview for a while. And everyone, she's got a brand new book out. It's called The Weird and Wonderful World of Bats, Demystifying These Often Misunderstood Creatures. We love bats. Nancy and I have lived in places where bats are part of our life. We coexist with them and appreciate them, but I know there's a lot of fear. So everyone, you can go to Alyson's website, AlysonBrokaw.com, and that's Alyson. So welcome, Alyson. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me.
Now, do you like the bats in the background?
I love it. I recognize the Austin Bat Bridge.
Yes, I got to give a shout out to Sharon K. Kurtz, who's a travel writer, and she did a whole piece on Austin with us, and she talked about the bats, and there's like a bat festival right over there.
Yeah, I actually went. So I lived in Texas for a while. And I think we went twice to the Austin Bat Festival. It was a good time. It's fun to see a city like embrace their bat neighbors.
Yeah, because of people's fear. And it always comes around Halloween. I know, isn't there like a bat week or bat awareness week or something in October?
Yeah,
because
the
of
bat
that.
yeah, it's been going on for at least 10 years, probably longer. And yeah, they purposely set it up to end on Halloween. So it's always whenever Halloween is, it's always the week before that.
Yeah, to make sure people don't do silly things to bats. Well, let's go into the importance of bats. I grew up with them, just always, when we lived in Africa and in Kenya and South Africa, bats were part of life. And then also living out near Joshua Tree, and then out in the Sonoran Desert. I mean, bats, they love the saguaro flowers too, but also they do hang out on hummingbird feeders. If you wonder where your juice went overnight, a bat visited. But they're massive. Those are massive bats. Have you hung out in the Sonoran Desert and seen the bats out there?
I have not seen the bats in the Sonoran Desert, but I was fortunate enough I have been able to see one of the three nectar feeding bats that are in the US, the Mexican long-nosed bats. I was able to help out a colleague with some work at a maternity colony in southern Texas.
Cool.
So we got to see them.
They're cool. Well, you got into bats as a little girl, right? In your book, you were talking about that.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
I was, a nerdy outdoor science kid, and really loved animals. We would see bats flying around. I grew up surrounded by forest and fields, and so we would see the insect-eating bats out flying around, especially in the summertime. And so that was always fun to watch. And then I was lucky enough to, in high school, see some tropical bats when we did a trip to St. John in the Virgin Islands.
That's cool.
Which was different because they look different than the bats that we have around here. And so that was kind of interesting. And then, I dabbled in bird research for a while. And then as I was finishing up my undergrad, I decided that I really liked bats. And so I specifically looked to pursue bats during graduate school.
That's so cool because they're so important to us as humans, right? And that's why I always want to go with wildlife and nature conservation, even if it's plants, because plants are, we need to protect the plants to protect the animals. And I think sometimes when, like say a development's coming in and they'll say, no, we got to save this piece of land because this specific bat or frog or whatever it is lives there. And people go, yeah, but it's only a frog, right? Or something like that. Or it's just a bat. And then if people think of, blood-sucking bats, then they really go let the development happen, right? And those meetings are so crucial in a community when you have that open mic to take that open mic and have and voice those concerns, because once developments start built, I mean, we need housing, right? But there's a balance that has to happen. So I want to go to that with bats about how important they are to humans, so people may protect them a little bit more.
Yeah. So, bats. So they are found everywhere, pretty much around the world. So I like to say that if you go somewhere on the planet, chances are there's at least one bat that lives there, which I think really speaks to just how diverse and
Yeah,
broad and that
that's
we interact
amazing.
with them in pretty much everywhere we go, and they do play really important roles. The insect eating bats, particularly in temperate areas like the United States, are really important for pest control. So if you like to eat corn, if you wear cotton clothes, um, if you have a garden or you rely on vegetables from your local farmer, uh, bats are helping protect those plants. They really love to eat the
Mm.
insect pests that eat our crops, particularly things like a lot of moths that will infest crops. Bats love those. Um,
Hmm.
as you move into more tropical areas, or right, you mentioned the bats draining the hummingbird feeders in places like Arizona. So those bats are important pollinators for
Mhm.
a lot of plants, both sort of plants that are important for maintaining wild ecosystems. I know you mentioned the saguaro, but those same bats that we see in Arizona and Texas and New Mexico, they also like to pollinate agave, which is where we
Mhm.
get tequila from.
Okay, there it is. Now she got to the point.
Yep.
That's it. There we are. We want our tequila. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. But is it that's interesting about the bats because like I know that there's a specific butterfly species if it doesn't have the bloom of this one yucca out in it's Southern California out in Anza Borrego Desert State Park. There's these specific ones, and if it doesn't, if we take those out, that but you're going to say goodbye to that butterfly. It's so endemic to that region and that plant. So
Mhm.
does it get down to that for bats?
Not quite that
Okay.
close. So the bats that we see, the nectar feeding bats that we see come up into the United States are migratory. So they don't
Mm.
spend the whole year even in southern United States. They are coming up to maternity roost to give birth to their babies. But in the wintertime, they are spending time in roosts through most of Mexico and
Mm.
into Central America. And so they are having to do this huge migratory journey every year. And while they will feed on a variety of cactus, plants, whatever sort of blooming at the time, they do rely on timing their migration with those blooms,
Mm.
and timing and matching the route they take with where those plants are, because they need that energy to get through the like
Yeah.
1,000 miles or whatever the distance is. And so there's been concerns and a push to sort of help support these migratory corridors where we see the bats moving to make sure that these wild agave and these wild cactus are still there, for the bats to fuel
So
up.
they're like they're working together. There's a symbiosis between the two of them, just like we need each other.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
and so these migratory, it sounds very much like the monarch butterflies, right? These corridors and for birds. So it's like, what can we do to help bats in their in I mean, is there plants that we should be having in our gardens? Should we turn our lights down like what we do for birds? What can we do as in our homes?
Yeah, that's a great question. And a lot of it depends on sort of where you live, but some things that I like to recommend and that people have been recommending more recently. So yeah, so you mentioned gardens. So planting native plants is always
Mm.
a good way to support ecosystems, whether it's to support the local bats or support local pollinators, which are related.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah, you can find there are certain like native night blooming plants that will attract moths and those kinds of things, which will then in turn help support the bats that are nearby.
Good, we're doing an interview on night blooming plants, so I'm
Oh, nice.
excited. The datura, come on, everybody, the
Yeah,
datura is
yeah.
so
So,
pretty.
so planting native gardens. There's Bat Conservation International has some resources on
Oh,
uh,
okay.
creating bat gardens. So, sort of suggestions of
Ooh.
how you can do that. Yeah, things like minimizing lights. We do know that bats are to some extent probably negatively affected by lighting at night.
Okay, so the dark sky communities are really important for so
Yes.
many
Yep.
species.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yes. If you, depending on where you live, and if you have the space, especially in like desert areas, if you can have water sources,
Mm.
bats love
Yes, they do.
water. So if you've ever been near a lake or a pond in the summertime, there's usually bats there. It's a great source of
They
food.
used to come down in the pool and dip. We would go
Yep.
nighttime swimming just to be there, and they would
Yeah,
dip
yeah.
in, and we'd be all like,
Yeah. So yeah, so a
it's
lot of
right
times
here.
they visit pools, particularly in the south where it gets really hot. And so having water can be really important for them. Uh, and then just if
Nice.
you even if you can't support, oh, another one is if you can, like leaving up like dead snags, like dead pieces of dead tree, if you
Mhm.
can do it safely, um, leaving those up because those are another good source of habitat for
Oh,
certain bats like to roost in uh,
yeah.
dead trees or in bark crevices. So in addition to birds, it can help support bats. So if you
Mm.
can do that safely, that's another one where,
I
um,
love this.
yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, I want people to see them because once they you when you can watch them, I know like the National Wildlife Federation has that wonderful program of, creating a backyard habitat. And once kids and parents and I think the kids help parents and vice versa. I know that happened with you, right? Your dad and everybody getting you
Yeah.
like, hey, watch this.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, you're the perfect example. Now, like, look at you. Like, how many, I mean, I don't know how many degrees you have, but it seems like you're always studying or traveling, watching bats, doing things, and then you write a book. So as a little girl, did you ever think you'd be traveling to all these far-flung places in the world and writing a book and,
I mean,
doing this?
I definitely hoped to be. I know that was, I remember looking at like the Ranger Ricks and the
Oh,
National
yeah, right.
Geographics
Yeah,
and
yeah.
seeing I have like images of the strangler fig trees and like, these really complex tropical plants and being like, I want to go in the
Yeah.
jungle. And
I'm with you on that. I mean, it was like any project you could do in a Ranger Rick book. That was like a thing.
yeah.
I always get those big like these big like I had binders like I
Mm,
don't yeah anyway yeah it was so cool yeah it's fun and that's the thing. I think that bridges a gap if kids can do something in their backyard. There's that whole project to have create your backyard as a national park too, which I really love because then that fear goes away and we can coexist and watch. And your book does such a good job of not humanizing them. There's something where we overstep that boundary. And I think that's where we actually have these accidents between humans and animals, is
mhm.
that we've humanized them in some ways too much. But you've done this balance of showing like, here how cute they are. They're like little monkeys, flying monkeys from the Wizard of Oz. But they are. They're like little, and I think we always think of them as birds. You were talking about birds, but they're not birds. They're not related at all, right? So, but the
Yeah.
pictures in your book really make them more accessible for people not to have so much fear.
Yeah, and I think that's something that I have long thought about when I am talking about bats. And one of the goals that I had in writing this book, because I do think most people do not encounter bats up close. Right, you maybe see them flying around at night near your
Mhm.
forest, but they're far away. They're up in the sky. Uh,
Mm.
they look bigger than they actually are when they're flying. Like even I'll be looking at a bat and I'm like, wow, that looks huge, and then I have to remind myself, like, wait, no, they are only like 5 inches big.
Okay. All
So
right.
they,
Yeah.
they 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 can be deceptively large looking when they're out flying around. Um,
Or at your hummingbird feeder. I mean, I remember just
yeah,
like because they're big and you're like, dang. What it
yeah,
is too is you're used to the little hummingbirds, and then all of a
yep.
sudden this one is like swinging. They're like, I'm sorry, they are monkeys.
Yeah, they can be a little bit, yeah. But yeah, so right, most people we only see them flying around. We don't usually see them up close, or when people have encountered them up close, it's been in situations where it's not ideal, right? It's unexpected, it's a
It's
surprise.
in your
You
bedroom.
are sleeping up and you've woken up to a bat flying, right? Like
Yep.
you're not in your best self. The bat is not its best self. Um, and so something I really like to just try to show is, yeah, like here's what they look like. They're just little teddy bears, little puppies with wings.
And
And
little pushed up noses.
yes,
I mean, their
yeah, they're
noses are cute.
Yeah, they're hugely diverse. We have they're the second most diverse group of
That's amazing.
mammals.
But you know
Um,
what? Even that, how many times do we even think that they're mammals, right? How many people think that bats are rodents, do you think? And then you bring up that like are what are rodents? They are mammals, right? So we
yep.
always forget about all of that too.
Yeah, and I always like to one of my favorite facts and cool findings from the past like 15 years or so is yeah, we think of them as flying rodents, but when we actually look at their genes and sort of trace who they are most related to, they are more closely related to carnivores and like hooved animals like deer and
Wow.
whales, weirdly, than they are related to rodents, to mice and rats. So
Wow.
even though they look kind of rodent-like, they have very different uh, ecologies. So they reproduce slowly. Um, they live really long lives,
Mm.
surprisingly long for how small they are. And yeah, they're more closely related to your pet dog than they are to a mouse. So they
Wow.
really are sky puppies, is what I always
What
like
it's
to say.
it's like a elephants being related to a hyrax. I don't know what they
Mhm.
people know in Africa, the Dassies. They're like marmots,
Yeah, no,
kind of. Am I
yeah,
getting that? Yeah, like kind of like that, little ones.
yeah,
They're so cool though. They're so
yeah, they
cool. And
are.
you
They
look
are
at
cool.
that, you're like this big mouse related to an elephant. That's insane, right? It's like, but that's when we have to look at evolution.
Yep.
So, are you seeing any changes in bats over time? I mean, I mean, our time here on the earth is like minuscule compared to animals,
Yeah.
right? In evolution, but have they changed a lot? Like, when you look at birds, like, crocodiles are still crocodiles. It's so interesting when we look at the animals over evolution, how some are like, don't mess with me, I'm perfect. Like,
Yeah, I mean, bats have been around a decent while. We have fossils. A lot of them have been
mm,
uncovered from like in Wyoming area.
oh, okay.
And they are around 52 to 55 million years old. Um, so yeah, so bats as we know them with wings, we think that these fossil bats that we have evidence for were probably echolocating. So they are bats as we think of them, go back at least around 52 million years, if not
Mm,
farther. Bats have the downside of being small, so uncovering fossil evidence for them is can be tricky. You have to have just the
yeah,
right conditions. So there's definitely gaps in our the fossil
sure.
record when it comes to bats. But yeah, so they've been around for a while. They've been echolocating the in the night skies for quite a long time.
Wow, it's
We have
amazing.
yeah we have seen right. I mentioned they're hugely diverse. So in that 52 million years, they have diversified quite a bit. They cover almost every possible diet that you could think of an animal having. Bats, a bat somewhere has that diet. We have carnivores, we have fish-eating bats, we have the insectivores, fruit eaters, seed eaters, leaf eaters.
Okay, what about the flying ones? Because this, there's flying squirrels, and then I read, no, they're really not wings. It's really this. It just kind of lets them push on even longer. It's not really a wing. It's not what we think. So with bats, I mean, maybe that's where we think that they're like birds, because of
Yeah,
that.
so bats are one of the things that makes them cool is they are the only mammals capable of what we refer to as true powered flight. So
Oh,
a flying squirrel is more of a glider. So they have their forelimbs and they have a skin or membrane that sort of goes between those and lets them kind of think of it more as like parachuting
yeah, I was gonna say, so it's like if we're
or like
paragliding, we have help.
paragliding. Yeah.
We have
Yeah.
help. We have those
Whereas
extra wings. Yeah.
whereas bats are powering themselves.
Wow.
Their wings are actually hands. So they're modified hands that now have this membrane between them. The fingers have grown really long. Uh, the
Cool.
the the word for the group of animals that are bats, which is Chiroptera, that's the mammalian order in which bats belong to, roughly translates to hand wing
Oh,
because
wow.
of that trait. So I always like to kind of say that bats fly with the power of jazz hands.
That's cool. That's cool.
Um,
Well, speaking of that, because they make noise, and that's something I think we as humans can identify with, and then maybe also goes into like birds make noise, well, so do bats, but they do. You talk about they, I mean, they click, they chat. I mean, there's beetles that there's clicking beetles, right, and stuff like that too. So it's this is fascinating. So if you can tell people a little bit about their sounds, because that's is that part of how they get through their migration, is that kind of thing.
Yeah, so bats are neat because for many of them, they have since 52 million years ago, when they kind of we first know that they existed, they use sound as part of their way to navigate and get around. So that's the echolocation. So they are flying around, they are shouting into the void as they're out flying around at night, and then they listen for the echoes when that sound bounces off of objects or insects or whatever. And what's really cool is while not all bats echolocate, most of them do. So around 80% of the world's bats are echolocators, and they have evolved a whole variety. So not different species echolocate differently, which is cool because we can eavesdrop on them. If you have a
Oh,
microphone and a bat detector that can detect their echolocation calls, we can tell the species simply based on that call.
oh, like
Uh,
birds, because that actually
yes,
helps
very
you
similar.
identify
Yeah,
a bird before you
yeah.
see it half the time.
Yeah.
Oh,
And
cool.
they can their the echolocation calls themselves are very flexible, so they can adjust their calls depending on if they're in open space, if they're in a more cluttered forest. Some bats use constant frequency, so they're emitting a sound at one constant note. Uh,
Wow.
Others have more complicated. So that's echolocation. Most of that is above human hearing range. So we don't hear that if we're outside at
Okay.
night. We don't hear them making all this noise. There are some exceptions. Actually, there's a few in particularly the Southwest United States and in Florida where there are a couple bats that do have echolocation calls that humans can hear. And it sounds like a high-pitched bird chirp, basically. uh,
Okay, that's cool.
yeah.
That's really cool. I mean, it's I we saw bats in Lake Havasu, Arizona.
Mhm.
We went on a gondola ride under the London Bridge, and the guy was singing opera in Japanese and German. So, and then all of a sudden the bats came out. I'm like, what is going on?
Yeah.
It's a little
That
different.
sounds quite, yeah, it's quite the experience.
It was at sunset. It was cool. I loved it. But it's interesting about the sound. So this is way above what we can hear and understand for most of them. But you can record it through recording devices
Yeah.
and
Yep.
go from there as scientists, which is cool. That's what I love about iNaturalist. You go on, you
Mhm.
can listen and watch and be part of that. So that's a way we can get involved too, is do those kinds of things, is
Yeah.
citizen science of putting that up. Does that really help biologists when you do things like that?
Yeah. I personally haven't necessarily worked with that kind of data, but I have had colleagues who are
Mm.
pull observances, pull data from iNaturalist. There's another one called GBIF, which is I think like museum specimens.
Oh,
So people are able to pull that data, and yeah, it's a way to get, instead of us
mhm.
having to go out and sample every place, you can get all this data from lots of
So
different
cool.
people. Um,
Yeah, I need
yeah.
to get back on that. If every time I do an interview like this, I'm like, I need to go back and post more.
I know
Yeah,
I dabble in it every once in a while, and then
but and then people argue over it too. Then I'm like, watch this. Let's see
yeah.
what happens. No, it's this, it's that. No, all right, whatever. But it's good. But I love that because it's genuine interest. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? And
Yeah.
to have that kind of thing, and for kids, I think it's fantastic. Going back to so the sound too is communication. So, your book also makes the fact that they're not that far removed for how we humans act. We argue, they communicate, that kind of thing as well. So they're very we when we uh, I'm not humanizing, but we want to have that idea that they are like us. They are living, breathing, warm bodies,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there many species are very social. So the same way that humans are social, right? It means we have to be able to communicate with each other. And so bats have yeah, they have different types of sounds that they use to, they have noises that are like back off noises, get away from me. They have
Mm.
noises that are maybe more like attractive. So they have calls between things like mothers and pups, to help,
Oh,
help the mom find the pup and help the pup sort of identify mom. Uh, Bats, some species sing courtship songs. So the way we think of birds singing songs, some bat species do something very similar to attract mates.
wow.
Um,
It's like, I'm going to sing outside your roost
yeah.
and wake you up. So they sing, but then at the same time, don't they have a sense of smell that is also really important to them for getting
Yeah,
around
and so
there?
so sense of smell, yeah, so we tend to think of bats, they are very auditory driven. So sound is a very, very important sense for them.
Mm.
But what drew me to bats, and what I ended up doing my PhD research on was on how they use their sense of smell, particularly for fruit bats that are
Mm.
foraging for fruits in the forest. So we do know that uh, bats will use, or fruit bats will use smell to discriminate like different types of fruit. So to choose between like a fig versus a different type of fruit. They can also use smell to identify like ripe versus unripe
I
fruit.
was going to say, are they going for the fermented fruit?
Yeah.
Having fun with that.
uh,
Yeah.
Yeah, so smell is also a very important role, especially and then smell and then also vision. So bats
Mm.
can see. All of them can see, depending how well depends on the species and their specific ecology
Mm-hmm.
and sort of where they live and what they eat. But for the flying foxes, for those big bats that we think of in Africa and Australia and
Mm.
Asia, those guys don't echolocate. So
Okay.
vision and smell are thought to be particularly
Mm.
important for them, for getting around. So they're using vision to, make sure they don't run into trees, and then they are using smell to make decisions about food and
What about the ones that are carnivores and eating things? Because don't they also eat like dead meat, like vultures and things like that, or
so
no?
that is the one thing. So I mean, I said that almost every diet you can think of a bat does. The one exception, as far as we know, is there are no scavenger bats. Um,
Yet.
Yeah, so they could prove us
See, but
wrong,
that okay. I
but
love this
but
because I
so
want
far,
so far.
yeah, none of them are known to scavenge, which is probably
I
not too
love that you say
surprising.
so far because
Yeah.
that's where I think we um have a problem with understanding science sometimes. Is like, yes, it is always changing as we discover new things, right? So I love that you're saying as of now, like
Yeah. Well, bats are always surprising us. I mean, I would be very surprised if we ever learned that a bat was scavenging, only because
oh,
most of them are not very good at moving around on the ground.
okay. Okay, that makes
So
sense.
it would be a kind of a weird behavior for them to start doing, just given that they're not particularly well suited for it. Um,
Hmm.
so that's my 2 cents.
What
It
about
could prove me
fermented
wrong,
food
but I'd
though?
be very
Like,
surprised.
what about like if it's fermented vegetation? Would they do that? Like I know some animals do get drunk on
Um,
fermented fruit.
so I think I do mention this in the book, but that is a great question. People have tested that. So there's some evidence. So some of the bats, like the flying foxes, they appear to avoid overly fermented fruit. They will eat it if they absolutely have to. Um, but if they can choose, but so researchers tested
Okay.
how well they could smell ethanol. And the bats tended to avoid ethanol and methanol, right, which are both
Hmm.
alcohols, byproducts of fermentation of rotting fruit. Um, and the bats were attracted up to a certain point of like concentration, but then when that concentration gets too high, they avoided it and chose something else.
Hmm.
Um, but that was in the flying foxes. In a different study, actually some of my colleagues, they did test for neotropical fruit bats, so fruit bats that are found in Central and South America, they fed the bats sugars with varying levels of ethanol, and basically measured the bat BAC, blood
Hmm.
alcohol levels,
They gave him a breathalyzer.
and
Like
yeah,
everybody, slow
and
down.
basically they just found that these bats like could have these really high blood alcohol levels and they could still fly very well. So they probably aren't choosing overly fermented fruit, but they can get by if it's sort of if there's no other choice, they are probably making that
So they
decision.
can
It's better
drink
to
and
it's better to
fly.
eat than starve,
Right.
even
Well,
if you
no,
could.
no, that's fascinating because it's like, well, they understand, and but some animals, like once in a while, will do that. So I don't know if they're like
Yeah.
humans going, let's party. I don't know what's going on, but
Yeah, we don't know if they're we don't think the bats are necessarily seeking it out, but they can handle their alcohol if they have to.
wow, that's wild. That's wild, you know? So, again, not trying to humanize, but saying like there's some connections there in some ways. So they know better. They're like, all right, no, we're going to behave and be able to get to our next destination. I also wonder if it's part of when they're migrating. You know what I mean? So if they're migrating, they probably really wouldn't want to touch anything fermented, you know?
Yeah, and I'll add to the so some bats do migrate, but a lot of them don't. So we see
Okay.
so yeah, so the nectar feeding bats are a migratory species. We see migration in some actually a lot of the flying foxes are migratory.
Hmm.
They move from one area to another depending on like um wet dry seasons, and food availability is a big driver there. We see some insect eating bats, particularly in temperate areas, right? Same way birds, they summer in the north
So
and then they move
temperature
south. Yeah.
temperature
Um,
does affect certain species of bats.
yeah, so we have bats that are migrating, and then in the US and in a lot of temperate areas, most of the bats that we are encountering or that you're likely to see flying around in your backyard are probably they're making short distance movements to hibernate for the winter.
Okay. Okay. So if
We
they
see
okay, do they
variations
all
in
hibernate or no?
not all of them, no. So the ones that
Okay.
migrate generally don't hibernate. The ones that are hibernating aren't really migratory. And then we have some areas where bats are just active year round.
Okay, so because we travel and document parks and public lands, and one thing we're seeing is that a lot of caves, they're limited access, or like you have to watch your like do things with your shoes or whatever because of some, is it white disease? I don't know what, I can't remember the name, but we have things affecting bats. What can, I mean, is we need to be aware of that, like if someone isn't managing those caves, right? So just going
Yes.
around in caves as humans going, ooh, there's a cave, let's go in, may not be a good thing, right?
Yeah. So what you're referring to, I think, is white nose syndrome.
Okay, what, I knew there was something.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
So that is a fungal disease that impacts hibernating bats. So
Oh.
it's this fungus. It grows in the soils and on the surfaces of caves. Um, and when the bats come in and they go into hibernation, they've dropped their body temperature, they've lowered their metabolism, they've also reduced their immune response, and so this fungus is able to kind of move in and grows on the wings, ears, and noses of
Hmm.
these hibernating bats, which is not great. It disrupts the bat's hibernation. It causes them to wake up. They use more energy, and it's harder for them to survive the winter because they just don't have enough fat stores. So
Oh.
that has been around almost 20 years now. It was first observed in New York in 2006,
Mm.
and has rapidly spread throughout much of the Northeast and into central United States and Canada. It has continues to be detected in caves farther west.
Hmm.
But scientists and conservationists have tried to put in place a lot of decontamination protocols. So if you are a caver, it's really important that when you go into a cave, that you clean all your gear before you go into a different cave, and really make sure to decom, which is important not just for bats and not just for not spreading things like white nose, but is a good practice in general because you just never know what's living in soils. And so yeah, so really, really, if people are going into caves, yeah, trying to keep things as clean as possible, especially if there's movement between caves. So that's like the sticky mat that you've had to walk on, and
Yeah,
you might, sometimes people will, you'll get a survey like asking, have you been in a cave
yeah.
the last X amount of time or whatever. And then the other really important thing for the hibernating bats is making sure we don't disturb them during hibernation.
Oh, okay.
So being careful to avoid caves where bats are hibernating during the wintertime, because even just a little bit of disturbance, depending on the bat or depending on the species, can cause the bat to wake up, and that's just one more cycle. When they wake up, they burn a ton of energy. So during
Oh, I
hibernation,
see.
they've reduced their temperatures, they've slowed down their metabolism, they've sort of, they're in uh
They're in deep meditation.
yeah, they're in like
They've lowered their heart
yeah,
rate. Like,
they're in neutral. So they're
yeah, there you go.
completely
I
nine
like
months. And
that.
then every time they wake up, you've shifted them back into drive. And so that burns more energy just to get back to normal.
Mm.
And so every time they do that, that's energy that they're not going to have for the next time that they do it. And bats do wake up naturally during hibernation for various reasons, to clean out metabolic waste, kind of get some water, do things. But we want to limit the amount of times that they have to go through that process.
Any kind of fear thing, because that takes even more energy. Like if you're woken up, it's like, what? You know what I mean? So
Yeah,
maybe,
I don't know how much that, but yeah, I mean, it's really just, yeah,
mm,
it's the fact that, yeah, I mean, it's think of like if you're trying to sleep and every hour you're getting woken up, it disrupts your ability to do the things you need to do.
ask any mother.
Yeah, yeah.
But the hibernation thing is so fascinating because it's like, people think snakes are hibernating and don't come out. And that's not true. A warm day, a snake may come out and hang out in the sunshine. And like in November, that's when the babies are out. It's like this whole
Yeah.
other cycle. And people think, oh, they're going away. I'm like, mm-mm. You got to keep your eyes open because if it's a beautiful day, a slithery may come out. And by the way, they all hang out near electric boxes. I don't know what's going on with the heat or
Probably
vibration.
warm. Yeah, probably.
Yeah,
I would imagine the heat really.
yeah, they do. They
Yeah.
they hang out. Like if you want to see a rattlesnake in the Southwest, go near an electric box. They're there. They hang out there. But and so hibernation, like even bears are not like, we do a lot in Central California, Sequoia National Park, and they have caves there, a crystal cave, which is opening everybody again this year, finally, after 4 years from all the wildfires. But
Oh gosh.
yeah, it's like exciting. But they talk about bears hibernate, but for people going into the park, in Sequoia National and Kings Canyon, be aware that you still may see a bear who just decides, y'all, I'm coming out for a little bit
Yeah.
for some sunshine. So can that happen with bats? Like when you say they move around a little bit, they may go, hey, it's a beautiful sunny day, I'm going out.
Um,
Well, they don't really like sunshine, but
it depends on the species. So some bats, and I think where they're hibernating. So bats that are hibernating in, Michigan and the upper Midwest and into Canada, those species tend to, when they go into hibernation, they're there for the whole time. Some bats will do so hibernation, it's not really sleep. We kind of refer to it as sleep, but it's really
okay.
this unique sort of physiological state where everything is shut down or is put into neutral, to save energy. And so when we talk about bats being in hibernation, they are in that state for periods of weeks to months. I mean, and other animals do this too. So like rodents, there are a lot of rodents that will hibernate, and like, they don't move for like 3 months.
Oh wow.
Everything's turned off. Some bats will use what we call torpor, which is that state of being in reduced energy. But they can be in torpor for just a day. They might be in torpor for like a week, and then they will come in and out of that state. So bats will use torpor year round. If you have even if it's a nice nice summer in Pennsylvania, if we have a week of rain, bats may use torpor to save energy during that period of.
It's a rain day. I'm taking a rain pill.
Yeah, they're like, we're gonna bed rot, we're gonna stay inside. But yeah, so some bats will, they're in torpor for shorter amounts of time. Certain species are, aren't necessarily hibernating in a cave, so they're, doing these short little hibernation bouts or torpor bouts in a tree, and so they're maybe living in more mild climates
Hmm.
or more mild areas where there are
Yeah.
opportunities to come out and there's insects still. And
Well, that's
for these,
interesting
I'm
because
all speaking for insect eating bats too. So this is all bats that are in
okay.
temperate areas. In the tropics, we don't you don't see hibernation.
Yeah. In Kenya, when I lived there, there was we had a rainy season and a dry season.
Yeah.
It was a little, yeah. And the rainy season, as soon as it rained, all the flying ants would come out and everything. It was like the rain stopped and you could just look out and the world began. It's like
Yeah.
everybody was out to eat each other. It's like it's crazy cool,
Yeah.
But I do want to ask, so what about, we're looking at hibernation. What about so during the day are bats sleeping and at night they go out when we see them like coming out of the bridge, it's like, oh, we're waking up, the sun is going down, we're going out to hunt. But during the day, are they actually asleep or are they in that state?
So they're asleep. At least if you're thinking about like, peak summertime. Yeah, so they're sleeping during the day. They're not necessarily sleeping like all day. I mean, the same way that we don't sleep all night.
Yeah.
They're doing social activities, they're interacting with each other, they're, nursing pups or all these other
So you
things.
call them pups.
Yes, yeah, baby bats are called pups. Yeah.
See, it is cute.
Yeah.
It is
Um,
cute.
yeah,
Yeah.
so they're yeah,
So
during.
well, yeah, they're mammals, so they're nursing.
Mhm.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. So do they carry them on their back? Like, how do they carry their
Uh,
babies?
so some bats leave the babies in the roost, and just the moms will visit throughout the night. So the babies stay clinging to the inside of the cave.
Wow.
Um, that's for most of the bats in North America. So like the Mexican free-tailed bats, which are those are the ones in the bridge in Austin.
Yeah.
So they're leaving their babies in the cave while they are in the roost while they go hunt, and then they will come back throughout the night to nurse.
Wow. So the women are busy.
Yeah, and then but some species, so I think with more like a lot of the tropical, so with the flying foxes, and with some tropical bats, they will, especially if they move roosts frequently, they will bring their babies with them. And actually, the babies latch on to the nipples and then actually kind of wrap themselves around the stomach of their mom. So the
Wow.
babies are born, they've got big claws that they can help grip onto mom. Uh,
Wow.
yeah, and actually, some bats have certain groups of bats have a false nipple like around the
Oh,
pelvis,
wow.
kind of at the hip. Um, and so the babies actually will attach themselves to that false nipple and then wrap their legs around the mom's neck. So they're kind of like upside down,
Wow.
kind of
They are
like
monkeys.
like baby Bjorn, but like
Yeah.
upside down. So that's yeah. So the bats are carrying their babies against their chests.
Wow, that's cool though. That's
Yeah.
little heartbeats. Well, yeah, I mean it's fascinating to me. What are the biggest threats to bats? Is it habitat loss? Is it pollution, climate change, all three?
Kind of a little bit of everything. So it really depends on the specific species, but in
Mhm.
general, a big one is definitely habitat loss and like habitat change. So deforestation, conversion to agriculture.
Mm.
Um, a lot of infringing urbanization and agriculture also can lead to increased human bat conflict, so more interactions. In some areas bats are hunted for like as a food source,
Oh, that's
or
right.
or because they're viewed as pests.
Yeah.
So hunting and and persecution is an issue, particularly for the larger flying foxes. That's one of the biggest concerns for
Oh,
them. Climate change is a concern for some species. I mentioned the migratory nectar feeding bats. So there's concern that climate change is going to change the flowering timing of those plants that the bats rely on. Yeah, so it's a little bit of everything.
Mm.
In some places, it's invasive species. So in some islands, things like feral cats are a really big concern as predators that can go in and just,
Yeah, for birds too.
yep.
Mhm. Wow. Wow. So they have quite, I mean, because I was thinking, one thing we were concerned about is like we just had a little pool. It wasn't a, massive pool when we lived out by Joshua Tree. And we were worried about the water. I remember we didn't have like chlorine. We did something different because we were concerned about birds and bats and wildlife getting the water of a pool. Like that, just we were thinking, oh my gosh, if people are putting chlorine in their pool and these birds and animals are drinking that, can that hurt them? That was just one little thing. And then I think about like agriculture and pesticides and that are used because there's just so little. And even like if you have enough bats, maybe you don't need the pesticides. Like that's where my brain goes.
Yeah, I mean that's the yes, I think what's the number? So bats are thought to save farmers something like an average of $20 billion a year
Whoa.
in pest control services. And part of that number comes from the not having to buy pesticides. So
Wow.
that's the idea. But yeah, pesticides are something that uh, we actually don't have as much research on about how pesticides might be impacting bats. But it's definitely a concern. So that's another thing. We talked about what are things that people can do, is minimizing pesticide use as much as possible, right, for everybody, but including
Mhm.
for the bats.
Mm.
The less chemicals that we're exposing wildlife to, because
Even our pets. I mean,
yeah,
so many pets have allergies now, and I go, what's going on the lawns?
yeah. And what we do know from work in with pesticides and bats is it impacts them the same way we know it impacts certain insects and pollinators, right? It impacts their nervous systems. It can linger in their bodies for a long time. So it's,
Oh,
yeah.
that could be like a nervous thing. Okay, so the last question too is you were talking about them being related to whales. Is that part of their communication system, do you think? Because whales have that way of, I don't know, they have an amazing communication system, even how they migrate, how they communicate, and it's incredible. So I wonder about that relation in like connection, like they have that same
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah, it's an interesting
network.
question. I mean, I think so in that case, it's probably what we would refer to as like sort of parallel or convergent evolution, where, a
Hmm.
similar solution has evolved to solve sort of the same problem, which is
Oh,
being
okay.
able to communicate with each other. So like um, I mentioned the bats 52 million years ago, where we think they were echolocating in some form. All mammals pretty much have, right? All mammals have some form of acoustic or communication sounds that they make. Um, and so it's just if when animals are living in sort of these various different types of social environments, they need to be able to communicate with each other. And so we see similar patterns in how they've solved that
Yeah.
problem of having to talk to each other. And
It's kind of like Canadian geese when they fly together. Like, isn't that amazing? How they
Mhm.
know how they get information and have that communication. That's I look kind of look at that as bats. Like they get in the cave and they're like, dude, don't go down that far. It's not as far as you think. You're gonna hit your head, you know. I have my own way of thinking of things. It doesn't mean it's right, but that communication of like who's at the front of the migration? Are they telling what's going on to the back? You know what I mean? Hey, I see this. Like watch out. It's like somebody has the GPS, or do they all have the GPS at one time when they fly?
Oh,
You
for
know?
bats?
Yeah.
They probably all have the GPS. So it's actually interesting you bring that up, because some of my people that were in the lab that I did my PhD in, one of the things that they were studying was how bats fly in these large groups without running into each other. Because you can imagine, right, if you're in an auditorium or a cocktail party and everyone's talking and it's really hard to hear what the other person is saying, like, now imagine that you're a bat and you rely on being able to hear and navigate those sounds to get out of your cave. And then some of these caves, some of these roosts have, thousands and millions of bats are all trying to get out at once. So how are they able to solve that? How do they get out without running into each other or running into things? And the answer is that they just run into each other and they run into things. It's part of it. So they're not quite like when we think of groups of bats, or if you think of like
so they're not like the Canadian geese who has a formation and
not as much. No,
wow.
they are a little more every bat for themselves. They do have their strategies that they sort of adopt to kind of maximize their ability to get information, which when they all do it, it does sort of benefit the group. So one of the examples is when they're echolocating. So they're emitting an echolocation pulse every X amount of time. And when they're in these large groups, they will sometimes drop a pulse. So instead of emitting a pulse every, 10 milliseconds, they'll skip a couple. And so there might be a bigger gap between the calls, which is just, right, more silent. And if all of them are doing that, it makes it quieter overall, right? And so, yeah, they're not like the flocks of starlings where when you see them flying, they're big mass and they're all coordinated. Bats, if you look at slow motion video of bats like leaving a cave, they're knocking into each other. They're hitting.
That's funny.
Yeah, it's but they're small enough, and the brushes are small enough that it doesn't hugely negatively impact them. But it is kind of funny to watch.
You could put a slow motion video and put like different music to it. Yeah, like different, kind of cartoon stuff. That's cool. Well, thank you so much for number one, writing the book. Was that fun to put that together?
Yeah, it was. It was fun to kind of dig in and think about things, especially stuff that I didn't necessarily study, especially some of the topics on like diseases and like longevity and what we're learning from bats, and all that stuff is not things that I was specifically doing my research on. So it was cool to get to dig into all of that and learn some stuff myself.
Yeah, and for us, I mean, it's like all these facts that it's kind of like a myth buster, as well, and like teaching us all these fun facts and definitely gaining some extra appreciation. And the photos too, I love the photos as well. Just kind of getting people to like not be so fearful. I mean, I don't know where the whole thing is of someone, like a bat's gonna suck onto your neck. I don't know. They're cool.
Yeah, I agree.
They're cool. They're cool. I've camped with them in my tent. They wanted to hang out, and I was like, all right, they were big. They were big. You've been to Africa. Those things, they're pretty big.
They're the big ones, yeah.
Yeah, they're cool though. They're cool. But I think they were even bigger than the bush babies. We had those little baby bush babies.
Yeah, they probably are.
Yeah. Wow. So everyone, again, you can go to Alyson's website. The book is out now, The Weird and Wonderful World of Bats. And you can go to her website. It's out through Timber Press. Timber Press does just amazing line. They're just one of my favorite publishers. But anyway, go to AlysonBrokaw.com, and that's ALYSON. And you can also follow her on social media as ALYB_Batgirl, because Alyson is the Batgirl. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to Big Blend Radio. Keep up with our shows at bigblendradio.com.